All right, it looks like we're back. Just checking to see if we've got people on again. I'll wait for people to start joining. Okay, we've got a couple of people starting to come back on. Sorry about the break, folks. It seems like our friends at Facebook Live will only let you either do video or share screen, but not switch over in the middle of of a show. So we give it another minute, let people finish joining. If you can hear me, make a comment in the comment section so I know you're there. And as soon as we get up to our previous numbers, we'll get going again. All right, there we go. Got some people joining. We'll give it another minute here before we kick things off. Glad to see people getting back on again. Again, my apologies. We were having I was having problems getting it to switch over from showing my live camera to sharing screen. You can do that in just about every other medium, but here they don't seem to allow the option in Facebook Live. So, kind of disappointed. This is my first time going straight off Facebook Live. I usually use the Be Live platform to share. So, yeah, a little disappointed with this. I think I'm going to switch back to Be Live next time. All right, let's get going, guys, because we're already 6 minutes in, and we'll get a few more people joining. Um, all right, Lost Leviathans. This is a series of presentations that I cooked up kind of as I was creating my database for what shipwrecks I wanted to look for. Right, I was interested in ships that were still missing, and by ships that are still missing, I don't mean ships that that are under a beach or ran on a reef or that you know. Are sunk in a harbor. I mean, ships that sank out in the lake, far from shore, and have never been found. There are a lot of most shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. Most people are aware. Were lost by being blown aground or being blown ashore. Right? The Great Lakes are an enclosed space, so if you're on the ocean and you get in a big storm, you can usually run before the storm until it blows itself out. But unfortunately, on the Great Lakes, if you try that, you'll be in somebody's cornfield in 2 or 3 hours. So again, the vast majority of shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, probably 70% of them, were really caused by ships hitting reefs or having collisions in harbors, hitting piers and sinking themselves and just being left there. But a significant percentage of them sank out in the lake, and we're starting to find them over the last 20 years, and I'll show you some statistics. A lot of these wrecks have been being found, and so um, there's a tremendous amount of interest, but there's also a real lack of knowledge about what ships really are out there yet to be found. So that's kind of what gave me the idea for this Lost Leviathan series. And what I found is that there are some real differences between like the 5 different Great Lakes and how many ships there were missing on each lake. For those of you who tuned in last month to the Lake Michigan version of this, you got to see that I have a list of over 220 ships that are still missing out off the shore in Lake Michigan. That's a huge number. And in fact, Lake Michigan has the most ships still missing. That doesn't mean it has the most shipwrecks, although it's pretty close. Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Erie are all pretty close. So give you a little bit of background about me. So Lake Superior is something that I'm deeply interested in because I'm from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I come from the Copper Country, the Keweenaw Peninsula up on Lake Superior. I'm not going to go through this in great detail because a lot of you already know about my background and what I do. I'm interested in a lot of different things. I'm interested in the shipwrecks up in the Keweenaw, obviously. Every X on this little map is a Keweenaw shipwreck. I've researched just about all of these. I'm also interested in the shipwrecks out at the Beavers and the Foxes, and I found a lot of targets out there in northern Lake Michigan that are shipwrecks that I've identified over the years. Many of you have seen my book, Fathoms Deep But Not Forgotten, Wisconsin's Lost Ships. which is a real encyclopedia of every ship that was lost in southeastern Wisconsin. I also do plenty of wreck hunting. This past 2 years, I found 3 significant wrecks with my partner Bob Jake, and then I'm perhaps better known, or best known even, for collecting Great Lakes maritime antiquities, antique books, antique maps, antique photos, and of course my social media presence on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. Here's the commercial part of my presentation. I'm the president of the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association. We help provide opportunities for the public to participate in underwater archaeology. We are going wreck hunting with as a WUA project this spring. Going to go look for a wreck. If you're not a member, consider joining. It's $20 a year at wuaa.org. And I'm also involved with the GLAMA, the Wisconsin Maritime Museum, and I'm on the advisory council for our new national marine sanctuary, the Wisconsin Shipwreck Coast. So, let's talk about Lake Superior's missing ships. Many of you who have seen that the Western Reserve was just found by our friends up at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. This is a piece from my collection here. This is an actual artist's rendition by George Coffin, who was a real well-known graphical artist in the 1890s. This came from the illustrated newspaper The Graphic, and this is a watercolor he did based on a first-person interview with the sole survivor of the Western Reserve. And this shows the ship as it went down after breaking in half on Lake Superior. The Western Reserve was one of the biggest ships still missing on the Great Lakes and on Lake Superior until last year. Those of you who were at the Ghost Ships Festival this year know that she was found. So let's talk about that. These are the top 20 ships in size that were still missing on the Great Lakes in 2010. The ones that are in bold have all been found. They've all been found since 2010. That doesn't leave too many. The big one still missing is the Carruthers on Lake Huron from the Great Storm of 1912, or 1913. 529 feet. That's a huge ship. She's way far from shore up in Canadian waters, we think, but the Henry B. Smith was found in May 2013. Really, the biggest one, and I'm going to talk about it tonight, is the DM Clemson on Lake Superior. But the Steinbrenner was just found. As you can see down here, the Western Reserve was just found, number 16. So a lot of these big ships are being located, and they're being located kind of by a small group of people. But one of the reasons that I'm interested in this is that NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Aeronautical Administration, has announced Project 2030, which is a project to map the bottomlands of the Great Lakes in high resolution using multi-beam sonar by 2030. And so they've been finding a lot of shipwrecks. They started this. They found 30 shipwrecks between Milwaukee and Kenosha just this past 2 years, and a number of those were new to us. They don't find everything because the multi-beam sonar has got some weaknesses when it comes to locating smaller or shipwrecks that are lower to the bottom. So they do miss some. But generally speaking, we know that if they hold true to their word, every single one of these, with the possible exception of the Carruthers, because it's in Canada, will be found. So it behooves us to know about these because they will come up, and NOAA isn't interested in finding the shipwrecks. I want to make that clear too. They're not doing this because they're all interested in shipwrecks. They're doing it because they want to map the bottom of the lake. When they find a shipwreck, they have to report it to the state historic preservation officer in whose waters it lies. The SHPO may or may not, even mention that it was found. Like in Wisconsin, we look at them right away, but a lot of the states don't have any budget. They don't have a state underwater archaeologist. And so you may never hear about some of these discoveries if they're made by NOAA. All right, let's talk about how we know the data about the numbers of missing ships that I'm going to talk about. Where did I get this data from? Did I just read a bunch of books? And the fact of the matter is no. I know about these ships because I did original research. I was involved in a project with a group of about, I'd say 15 maritime historians that was coordinated by David Swayze to create a database of every commercial vessel that was lost on the Great Lakes. And so we did this over a course of about 15 years. We all contributed news clips to him. This is back in the days before you could just, go to newspapers.com. We all had to go to the library and use microfilms. But we came up with a database of about 6,000 actual shipwrecks from accidents where the ships never sailed again. The vast majority of these, as I said, were ships that blew ashore or ships that hit shoals, right? Um, so we know of about 6,000 accidents. Now, a lot of those were removed, right? They don't have any remains. Um, but if you were to include all those historical wrecks, plus all the things that we call shipwrecks but aren't, right? Old hulks, sunken harbors, things that were towed out and scuttled intentionally off of harbors, they're probably about 8,000. Extant, vessels that we would call a shipwreck. Let's talk about the lakes. They're different, and I'm going to emphasize that tonight. When you look at the numbers of shipwrecks in the database, and this is a statistically significant population of 6,000 wrecks, like we didn't skew it. Like we have researchers working on every one of the 5 Great Lakes. These are the percentages we come up with. We come up with Lake Michigan slightly leading the pack at 26.5%, followed by Lake Huron at 26.1% of the known wrecks, Lake Erie close third, and then you drop way down to Lake Ontario at 12%, and Lake Superior with the fewest. And this is really borne out. We see this in the data. Why Lake Michigan has so many wrecks and why Lake Huron and Erie are pretty close. So I think you could make an argument that, depending on how you count them, that any one of these three could be pretty even at the other. But Lake Michigan has a lot of wrecks because of the big cities. Vessel wrecks are a function of vessel traffic density, right? The more ships you have in an enclosed area, the more likely they are to wreck. The Lake Michigan also is this long north to south lake, so it doesn't have a lot of space. A lot of the ships on Lake Michigan were blown ashore on the coastlines, more so than on the other lakes. And so we have a lot of those kind of wrecks. But we also have a lot of small vessels. So when I looked at the 220 ships that are still missing on Lake Michigan, a lot of them are old schooners, right? Well, why doesn't Lake Erie have all these schooner wrecks? There are big cities there, and it was around a lot. There was traffic there much earlier than Lake Michigan. Well, the reason is that most of Lake Erie, when your schooner sinks, its masts are breaking the surface, and they were just able to raise a lot of them. The lake is 60 feet deep, except for the hole off Long Point. Well, why Lake Huron has so many is because it's the main artery that connected the lakes for interlake commerce, right? It was a transit lake, but it didn't have any big cities, right? The other thing about Lake Huron is that a lot of the wrecks on Lake Huron were big boats, and we're going to find that on Lake Superior too. Part of the reason it has fewer wrecks is because the Sioux Locks cut it off before 1855. Also, most of the ships that came up to Lake Superior were in the bulk freight trades, right? We have big ore boats, right? We have big schooner barges that are being hauled by the ore boats. They're bringing up coal, they're taking back, iron ore. These ships don't wreck as often. There's also a lot of open water, not as much to run into. On Lake Superior, you kind of can run before the storm, right? Without ending up in a cornfield. So Superior and Ontario also had very few major port cities other than Oswego, and that kind of petered out in the 1890s. So, and you had to go through the Welland Canal. So again, less wrecks, and you're going to see that today. So let's talk about the numbers of missing ships on the Great Lakes, what we really have. So one of the things we notice if we look at maps is that they tend to cluster around port cities and choke points, right? So this is Lake Michigan. This is Calvin Deviney, one of his charts. It's just good because it's one of the few charts that actually was well researched and shows you the spatial distribution of wrecks. This cloud here off Ludington and Pentwater is the lumber trade out of Chicago, right? And vessels that are ending up in storms, right? The old dive charts are also somewhat useful. You can kind of see here the clustering around Whitefish, the clustering around the Keweenaw, for spatial distribution of wrecks. But there are about 700 ships, we think, that are missing on the bottom of the Great Lakes from this empirical data from the Swayze database. Now, I've gone through the Swayze database and started to identify those ships that are still missing, that are far from shore, and that have not been found. And that's kind of hard to do, right? It requires some specialized knowledge. You have to be able to go in and figure out that this is a ship that, didn't hit a reef. It's actually went down out in the lake. But moreover, you have to know that it wasn't found yet. So in order to make to update the database, I've had to interview Dave Trotter. I've had to interview a lot of the wreck hunters on Lake Michigan. I've had to talk to a lot of people and say, hey, here's an obscure local wreck that went down off your port. Has anybody ever found it, right? And the answer, oftentimes is yes. And so they've been found. But So here are the rough counts of how many ships are still really missing by lake. About 220 on Lake Michigan. I haven't really finished Lake Erie yet, but I think it's going to be about 150. I think Huron was going to be 100, but I think it's a lot less. And there's one reason why there's a lot less missing on Lake Huron, and that's David Trotter. Dave Trotter's found most of the wrecks. He really has. He's found almost 100 shipwrecks out there by scanning the shipping lanes. So, um, and Lake Superior and Lake Ontario, I think, are each going to have about 70. And here's the moment you've all been waiting for. These are the 70 ships still missing on Lake Superior that foundered well offshore. They go all the way from the DM Clemson, the biggest ship still missing, all the way down to the 33-foot fish tug Vernon. Um, my ex-wife's great uncle was on this ship when it was hit by the big oarboat Harry S. Colby off Grand Marais in 1950 and sent to the bottom. Um, so I want to throw one caveat out there, and that's that going through the database, I was going by size. So these are in decreasing order of size. There could be a few wrecks in here where I didn't have that they just didn't have a length, and so they didn't show up in the database. I may be missing one or two, but this is 99%. I'm sure of it. There are really only about 70. If you wanted to get creative, you might be able to find 75. Um, they are all over the place, right? You've got the big steel freighters, and that's what you're going to see is still missing on Lake Superior. And then you've got wooden schooners that were being towed, right? But you don't have a lot of wooden schooners that were like sailing on their own, right? Very few of those. Almost everything was being towed by another vessel, right? Let me go back in there once. And you come down here and get to the smaller end, you've got some really you got a lot of tugs down here. And there are quite a few tugs and small propellers that are still missing on Lake Superior. But a lot of these are way out in the lake, right? Which is why they haven't been found. A lot of the low-hanging fruit has been found on Lake Superior. So, all right. Well, let's get into the some other details. I just want to mention a little bit more about how we know all this. So when we went through and pulled all these newspaper articles back, 30 years ago, we also went into like the federal records, into the National Archives, into the rec reports. We went into the enrollment certificates, things like that. And we really verified that these ships were in fact lost and didn't sail again. And we also have records for just about every vessel that ever sailed the lakes, and about 40,000 vessels, commercial vessels, we have records for that we know about. And so we have pretty good numbers. Like, this isn't just stuff that we pulled out of the air. This number of 6,000, this number of 8,000. Not a lot of these ships have extant remains, which is interesting. A lot of these ships were, cut up. They were just taken apart by ice and waves. So a lot of them don't have remains, which is why we're so interested in the ones that foundered far from shore, because they probably do. All right, let's talk about Lake Superior's Big 20. Real quick, I'm not going to walk through all these, but I want to call out a couple of commonalities here. So this is the top 20 ships. What you see right off the bat is that the top three are big steel boats. Then we have some big wooden vessels, almost all 300-footers. We got a couple of composites, again, big wooden ones. These were all vessels that were in the bulk freight trades, every single one of them. I mean, you can set your watch by it, right? I mean, the Bannockburn, the Steel Vendor, the Hurontown, the Servia, all of these were in the bulk freight trades. The other thing you're going to see about these that is fairly they have in common is that a lot of them are in deep water. They're far from shore. We don't know exactly where they went down. They're going to be hard to find. So that is one of the more interesting aspects. All right, let's talk a little bit about who's looking for them. So these guys right here probably found more of these wrecks than anybody. That's Ken Merriman, Jerry Eliason, and Craig Smith. They are on Craig Smith's Sea Dory, which is a frequent site up there on Lake Superior. They, along with the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, and then also Dan Fountain, are actively looking for these ships. I sometimes get up there, but I don't look out in the deep water. I'm more interested in the shallow stuff around the Keweenaw. But these guys are excellent researchers. They really dig in. All these folks really know what they're doing. It's hard to search Lake Superior because it's deep. You need pretty specialized equipment, something like what I use, this Garmin with a 260 kilohertz transducer works pretty well for finding deep wrecks. I think that's what most of the folks are using. Um, One of the things that this is Calvin Devine's Lake Superior map. He did this back quite a while ago, but it shows you spatial distribution of shipwrecks. And I apologize for chopping the ends off, but again, you're going to see that a lot of the wrecks are either at choke points or around ports, right? Like, up here at the lake, Canadian Lake had a lot of shipwrecks. Down here by Duluth, over by Whitefish, a lot of shipwrecks. Marquette, Keweenaw, especially the waterway and the point, a lot of shipwrecks. All right. Um, One of the big challenges to searching Lake Superior is the size and depth of the lake. So, and I've mentioned this before, if you want to look for shipwrecks on Lake Superior, you need a boat that gets gallons to the mile, not miles to the gallon. It's really a long way from shore. So, like the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society has the David Boyd, which is a very nice sized research vessel, and they can get out there safely and search far from shore. You need a good ROV or a drop camera. A lot of these ships are not going to be diveable, and but there's a big incentive to find them. These ships on Lake Superior are well preserved. They don't have quagga mussels on them. They look like the day they went down. They're unique historical objects, that tell stories. The Western Reserve, for example, that was just found, has a tremendous story. That's why they wanted to find her, not just because she is a big, you know, steel vessel, but because of the Minch family, and that entire story was just heartbreaking. And the sole survivor. I mean, you could make a movie out of that story. And there are also archaeological sites with a shelf life, so we know that these shipwrecks are deteriorating, right? They are falling apart. Even the deep ones are. And so we want to document these and get a look at them to see what happened to them and to record some of these artifacts from life over 100 years ago while we can still see them. So that's kind of why we want to find them. I am going to talk about finding ships tonight. I'm going to give you some search grids. We're going to look at where these ships probably are and talk about what's going to be required to find them. So, all right, let's switch channels here and talk about the Big Six. These are the six biggest ships still missing on Lake Superior, and I'm quite confident of this. I may be missing some of the smaller ones, maybe one or two, but these we are pretty confident about. So I'm not going to take you on a deep dive into each one of these solely because they're not household names. That's one of the interesting things you're going to see is that these ships are not, Edmund Fitzgerald's or Daniel J. Morell's. They're not Marquette and Bessemer number twos. A lot of these, honestly, I hadn't even thought of or hadn't. Like Dan Fountain reminded me of the Ferdinand Schlesinger. I actually forgot about that wreck, even though I had it on my database. So. I'm not going to grid these for you. Why? Because they really are far out there. A lot of them have, kind of workaday stories, right? The most interesting, the one that I am going to grid is the DM Clemson. This is a vessel that went missing with all hands in 1908. I am going to talk about that. But like the James Gailey was sunk by a collision in 1912. Everyone got off. Prindock was sunk by a collision as well off the tip of Isle Royal, Passage Island area. Ferdinand Schlesinger, 1919. The crew was rescued. The Orinoco, 1924. 5 lives were lost. She was lost, I think, off of the Canadian eastern shore of the lake. And then the William F. Sauber, 2 lives were lost. So where are these ships? I'll give you a little bit of a overview of where the big six are. So my apologies. This is not the Sauber. This is actually the Orinoco here. I called her the Sauber. She's 6 miles off Agawa Bay here. This wreck could probably be found. The water is, not astoundingly deep there, but again, poorly known location. The Sauber, 30 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. Again, this is a big grid. Difficult to know where she is, because back in these days, you have to remember, they didn't have LORAN, they didn't have GPS, they couldn't see shore at all. They were going by how far they had run and what compass heading they were on. So they were on these course lines, and this is sort of key to finding these wrecks, is you follow these course lines on the map that go around Keweenaw Point, right? And they're going to be not far from those. The James Gailey collided east of Manitou Island with another vessel, kind of way out, I think not quite to Standard Rock, 35 miles east of Manitou Island, way out there. And then you have the Schlesinger, 15 miles southeast of Passage Island, so she's up near Isle Royale, and the Prindock, which was on its way to Isle Royale on the shipping lane here, and she was north of Passage Island. Didn't quite make it there. Generally speaking, she's considered to be somewhere between Passage Island here and the Canadian Lakehead. But many of us have looked into this ship, and it's quite difficult to get accurate data on, like to where you could make a 10 mile by 10 mile search grid. If you can't make even a 10 mile by 10 mile square search grid for these wrecks, for my money, they're not worth going after. I mean, you kind of need an 8 by 10 or an 8 by 8 or better yet, a 5 by 5. If you can get that, I think it's a lot better. But that's just me. Those kind of grids don't dissuade people like Dan Fountain and Jerry Eliason. They've searched some bottom land. So those are the big six. I didn't want to go into too much detail just because gridding them, I mean, it's sort of like, okay, rinse, lather, repeat. Each one's pretty much the same as the other. What I thought I'd do for this talk is something a little different, and I hope you all enjoy it, and that is that I'm going to grid the famous five for you. Why do I call them the famous five? Well, this is something that I just cooked up out of thin air. There's nobody's ever talked about the famous five. There are other fairly famous wrecks on the lake, but these are five wrecks that I know are real interesting and a lot of people want to find. A lot of them are went missing cases, right, where nobody knows what happened to them. One of the things I will tell you about ships that went missing, right, vanished without a clue, is that never happens. Every one of these ships left debris on the surface, had debris that washed ashore, had last known positions, had sightings, some even had survivors. So they're not really, they didn't really go missing. However, their last known positions are generally not well known. They're conflicting loss accounts. And one of the big problems when you get into these famous shipwrecks is their accounts get mythologized. What do I mean by mythologized? Well, there are a lot of very colorful authors out there, who like to tell ghost stories, and they have excellent books, and they're fun to read. And guys like, let's talk about the Bannockburn, for example. James Oliver Curwood, dubbed her the Great Lakes Flying Dutchman and wrote a really colorful account. Or people like Dwight Boyer in his Ghost Ships of the Great Lakes talks about a lot of these ships, and he tells stories, a lot of which are kind of fanciful. And they become part of our maritime culture. They've been handed down from generation to generation, these fanciful stories about these legendary shipwrecks. And there's nothing wrong with that, I suppose, but at some point, when you look into them as real historical events, right, you start to see a different story. And in some ways, when we mythologize these, we do a disservice to the men and women who lost their lives on these ships, right? Because they're not ghost stories. They're not, fictitious tales. They're real disasters that killed people's loved ones and that created tremendous drama on the Great Lakes at the time. So my goal, oftentimes in telling these stories, is to demythologize the accounts and talk about the period from an historical perspective and what really happened. So let's dive right in. I'm going to start with the smallest and go up to the largest. This one might not be on most people's radar. She's not a typical Lake Superior shipwreck. She's the wooden schooner Merchant. For those of you who don't know Lake Superior history very well, she was landlocked, right, before 1855. And there was not large, but I think about 12 vessels were portaged up onto Lake Superior or built at Point O'Pins on Lake Superior prior to the Sioux Locks. There were a good number of them, and the Merchant was one such. She was actually built at Maumee River, Ohio, down by Toledo in 1834. Think about that, 1834. There was nothing on Lake Superior in 1834. But this vessel was only 70 feet long and about 20 feet wide, and she was a pioneer Lake Superior vessel. She was portaged overland through the streets of Sault Ste. Marie in 1845, along with several other significant vessels, including some steamships. I think the Monticello and the Napoleon, a few other good-sized steamers were actually dragged. What they would do is hook up teams of oxen to them and put rollers down right in the main street of Sault Ste. Marie, and they would haul these ships foot by foot. It would take them months. For a few months out of the winter, there would be a major ship right in the middle of downtown Sault Ste. Marie getting hauled over the portage, and then they would dump them into Lake Superior in the spring. And these were the ships that carried miners and supplies to the pioneer copper mining settlements on the Keweenaw. The Merchant was a pretty famous vessel, along with ships like the Algonquin and all the Whitefish and some of these other vessels from the American era. There were also British vessels prior to that, prior to the War of 1812, that were on Lake Superior. But those are the topic for another day. The Merchant was a really important vessel because there were only a few vessels that you could take on Lake Superior. And she had left Sault Ste. Marie bound for Lance, Michigan on Keweenaw Bay on June 12, 1847. She was well overloaded. She had a huge group of miners and workers. She had mining supplies and reportedly a large quantity of money because these guys had to, buy stuff. She was so overloaded that there were a number of people who chose not to go on her to wait for the next vessel. And I think there was she had a relief captain on board, if I remember correctly. This is an actual article from 1847 about her loss, the loss of the schooner Merchant. And it talks about, Captain Moore was detained on shore, and another captain, Captain Robert Brown from the schooner Swallow, another legendary Lake Superior early vessel, had to take command. This ship, when it left on the 12th, on the 13th, a severe storm swept over the lake, and the vessel was never seen again. The only debris that was ever reported was a cabin door that washed up on the Canadian North Shore the next year. So could have traveled from anywhere, right? As the currents of the lake, from the Coriolis effect, circulate on Lake Superior. Now, one of the things that we base almost the whole legend of this wreck on is an 1852 account that appears in the local papers that local native peoples off of Grand Island that were fishing reported masts about 30 feet below the surface off Grand Island. And that's all we know. There was an attempt made to relocate the masts, and they were unsuccessful in relocating these masts. So somewhere, and we do know that she would have been in the Grand Island area about the time that this storm was encountered. And so, the vessel being overloaded, and right about the time the storm hits, and then these masts being sighted, a lot of people are interested in finding this. She'd be one of the most historically important finds ever made on the Great Lakes. I would argue that this would even be a more interesting find in some ways than the Griffin, which is probably going to be a debris field. This ship could be completely intact from 1847, full of supplies from the formative years of the copper trade, in the early history of the state of Michigan. This would be just a fascinating find. So where is she? Well, she legitimately could be anywhere between Whitefish Point and Keweenaw Bay, quite honestly, And she could also be completely broken up. She could have, hit a reef and everyone died and nobody ever found the debris. But that seems unlikely. Based on the time the storm hit, she probably would have been in the Grand Island area. Given her mast heights, if the account is true, she's probably in 170 to 120 feet of water within a few miles of Grand Island, because that's the water depth there. So if the mast story is true, this is where I would look. And I would take a side scan sonar. And I don't know that people haven't. I know people have searched some of this. Pete Lindquist and people like that who run the shipwreck tours out there. I'm sure they've done some of this, but I don't know that it's ever been done in a deliberate or scientific way. you can see it gets real deep real fast, right? So real quick, you're out into an area where the masts wouldn't be visible from the surface. So it's a narrow thing, you know. It's only a couple of miles wide. This could be completely covered. Uh, will the merchant be found? I think someday she will be, particularly if she had indeed foundered somewhere offshore rather than hitting a reef. Even in 1847, there were plenty of people coasting. There were a lot of native communities around the lakeshore. I think had they broken up on a reef, a lot would have come ashore, and the native communities would have reported her. So I do think this ship is on the bottom in deep water, and I think she'll be found someday. It would be a tremendous, tremendous historical discovery. Probably the most important one on this list. So that is the Merchant, and she's one of my favorite of the famous five. All right. Let's dive into another really interesting one, and this is probably one of the most famous ships that's still missing on Lake Superior. It's the Sunbeam, the wooden sidewheel steamer. We have a beautiful picture of her. She was a Goodrich steamship boat. This is at Manitowoc. She was built in 1861 with this unusual propulsion system where she had instead of side wheels on the sides, she had propellers on the sides, which was abandoned pretty quickly, and then they refitted her as a normal side wheeler. She was built by William Bates, who was the progenitor of the clipper ship on the Great Lakes. This ship was lost in August 28, 1863, in a freak summer storm when she was bound from Ontonagon to Portage Lake. And when we say Portage Lake in 1863, we mean the south entry of the Keweenaw Waterway. The north entry hadn't been dredged yet, so she was going to go all the way around Keweenaw Point, come in the south entry, and go to Houghton Hancock, right? Um, she was carrying a pretty good size crew or pretty good size contingent of passengers. So they didn't expect any problems because it was August 28th, but she encountered a freak summer gale. She was traveling in company with the steamer Michigan, and they were in a stiff northeast gale. They got up off Eagle River, so they got pretty far, right, off the north shore of the Keweenaw Peninsula, and they decided to turn back for the Apostles because they weren't making headway. These sidewheel steamers were notoriously underpowered. So she was trying to make her turn, and she lost her engines during the turn, and she began to take on water. Her lifeboats were launched, but they very quickly capsized because they were in huge seas. They're probably in 15 to 20-foot seas, maybe 15-footers. So the famous part of this ship, and this is, this has been mythologized to the extreme, but it's true. There was a wheelsman. His name was Charles Frigo. They call him Charles Fraser in most of the accounts and Americanize it, but he was a Quebecois, Canadian. He stayed in the pilot house and gave up his seat to a woman. This is his statement on the lifeboat. And he braced himself in the pilot house as the ship sank beneath him, and he watched through the glass of the pilot house as the lifeboat capsized, throwing everyone into the lake and killing them. Frigo rode a crude raft that he had lashed together with decking to once the ship sank underneath him, and he found a keg of port wine floating nearby and pulled it with him onto the raft, and that, he says, sustained him for 2 full days before washing him ashore about 15 miles west of the present-day North Entry. So this guy drifted a long way. He was rescued by an Ojibwa coasting party, and they took him to, I think, to Houghton, where he was then taken to Chicago to give testimony. He was taken away so quickly that nobody knew that he had survived. And 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, he came back home to his hometown of Ontonagon, walked into his house, into his own funeral. That we know is pretty true, because Frigo lived, and he lived for a long time, and he was a pretty prominent guy in Ontonagon, and he would tell the story about this from time to time. And there are a few different accounts, not just the ones he gave to the paper or to the Steamboat Inspection Service, but oral traditions about Frigo's stories. He lived for quite a while too. I think he lived until almost 1900, or into well into the 20th century before he died. I did a genealogy on him one time. All right. So where is the Sunbeam, and where did Frigo come ashore? This is a difficult search grid. Her last known position is up here off Eagle River. We do have a news account of the miners at the Cliff Mine up, not the Cliff Mine, one of the mines up on the cliffs there, reporting seeing her. and seeing the Michigan. And the Michigan came in and threaded the Sawtooth Reef and came in, but the Sunbeam did not. Frigo came ashore way the heck down here. Um, I'm still at a loss to explain how that happened because the Keweenaw current, the dominant current, runs the other way. But the wind must have been out of the northeast to take him down this far, and as quickly as it did, too. Um, this is a difficult search grid due to the long time he drifted and the changes in wind direction. We don't know exactly how far the Sunbeam drifted before it sank. My suspicion is not real far. Like I think it went down fairly quickly because we don't. These sidewheel steamers, had big engines. They tended to go down pretty fast. You don't see a lot of accounts of these big steamers drifting 10 miles. I do have an interesting piece of folklore about this. My friend, the late commercial fisherman Art Lassinen, told me he once brought up a derby hat and a rocking chair from 500 feet of water in this area that you see out here of what I call the search grid. Jerry Eliason is actively searching this grid and has covered way more bottom out here than I show. I This is a hard find. The ship is out here somewhere, but it could be anywhere in this giant grid. And when I say that Jerry's not intimidated by large grids, I mean it. He's covered hundreds of square miles side scanning for the Sunbeam. Right out here in the same area is the Hudson and the SR Kirby, which have been found. And the Sunbeam should be just, probably southwest somewhere of them, but, anyone's guess. I do think they're going to find it, but it's a hard search. So the Sunbeam, really famous and really colorful wreck. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the minesweepers, the Cirasoles and Inkerman. These were steel minesweepers that were built by the Canadian Car Company for the French government. Right at the end of World War I, they needed minesweepers to clear the German mines off of French harbors, and so the Canadian government was contracted to build these for the French Navy. They were 143 feet long and only 21 feet wide, so these were not big ships, right? And only 21 feet wide. Kind of narrow, actually. They were lost on their maiden voyage on November 24th, 1918. For many years, nobody knew where these ships were. They could have been anywhere. The general, people said, well, they hit Superior Shoal, which is sort of the common story about every ship that went missing. When they discovered Superior Shoal back in the 1930s, or maybe it was the 40s, all of a sudden that became the boogeyman that took down every Lake Superior shipwreck. But it's since been searched and nobody's found anything out there. Anyway, it was about 20 years ago, an account surfaced of the captain of a third minesweeper, the Sebastopol, that was in company with these ships and was actually the sort of lead ship on this convoy of three minesweepers that were making their way down to Whitefish and to the Sioux Locks to go from thence out to France. And it was all in French. It had to be translated from nautical French. But what they found is that a lot of detail was known about what really happened. There were two Great Lakes captains, one on the one on the Cirasoles and one on the Inkerman, and the French Commodore, if you will, Captain Leclerc, was on the Sebastopol. They were originally headed from Passage Island straight down the shipping lane to the Sioux, but they began to hit 50-mile-an-hour winds in blizzard conditions with 20-foot waves in these little boats, and so they turned due south to try to shelter under Keweenaw Point because the wind was coming out of the north, out of the southwest and was really battering them. They got off Copper Harbor at about 11 p.m. on November 24th, and the Sebastopol got caught in the trough of the seas out here a number of times and almost sank. But she could see the lights of the two other ships, and they had decided they were going to round Keweenaw Point. At 1 a.m., so that's 2 hours later after they arrived off Copper Harbor, is all we know. We don't know the exact distance, or at least I don't. They lost sight of the lights of the Cirasoles and Inkerman as they were working to round Keweenaw Point. So, where are these ships? They've been searched for quite a bit, I should mention, too. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society and Michigan Tech University have searched for them without success. So one of the things we know is the wind swung around to be out of the west-northwest as the vessels ran for the lee of the point. So it had been coming out of the southwest, but it came around out of the north. They were sort of taking the storm on their quarter. Captain Leclerc, as I mentioned, lost sight of the two other vessels at about 1 a.m. as he was rounding Keweenaw Point, so right in this area here. They came inside, I believe, of Manitou Island, not outside of Manitou Island, although I could be, I'm sure Dan Fountain will correct me about that, whether if I got that wrong, but I think the Sebastopol came down inside and then ducked under into Bay de Gris. Now, that was the last that was ever seen of the Cerisoles in increment. A lifeboat from the Cerisoles washed up at Deer Park, which is right in line if you follow the wind from this area down on the South Shore. And really, the only testimony we really have is Captain Leclerc's testimony, but it is quite detailed. Now, Art Lassen, of course, was always full of stories, and they were all true. I've never found he brought up a human skull off the Huron Islands, which ended up being how the Olive Jeanette was found. So he told me that he snagged a large metal object on the bottom here, north of Manitou Island, and that it would come up about 20 feet. He could lift it about 20 feet, but that's all. And he eventually got his nets off, and when the nets came up, they were all covered with rust. So I'm pretty confident that Art snagged one of these minesweepers, or at least a good chunk of one. I think if I were to search from, this is a pretty broad search grid. I'm sure that other people have a better search grid than this, but because I confess I did not read Leclerc's entire account as translated. But I think this is a pretty reasonable area for where these minesweepers might be. And it's been searched, but the bottom off Keweenaw looks a lot like the surface off Keweenaw, and it's pretty rugged and difficult to search. So they could be hiding in the nooks and crannies out there in the various ravines and canyons that are on the bottom. So that's the minesweepers. Pretty famous wrecks. I think they'll be found someday, but it'll be a while. All right, let's talk about the Flying Dutchman, the Bannockburn. I've researched this in quite some detail. I have another talk I did about it. It's up on this Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group's YouTube channel, where I kind of debunk the ghost ship myth, and I actually get into why I think she was lost. But this was a steel bulk freighter built for the Montreal Transportation Company for the grain trade. She's actually built in England and brought to the lakes through the Welland Canal. She was 244 feet long, and she had a fairly long career of about 9 years in the grain trade, running all over the Great Lakes. One of the things that's kind of cool, I just found this postcard, a previously unknown view of the Bannockburn. It's kind of ghostly, too, which is what I like about it. It's filthy. It was really dirty, but this is her in the Welland Canal, one of the very few views that's known of her that I just recently discovered. Arguably Lake Superior's most famous wreck after the Fitz. I mentioned that Kerwood, kind of dubbed her the Flying Dutchman because debris kept being sighted from her, and every time a new piece of shipwreck debris was found, they would say, well, it's from the Bannockburn, and it kept her in the public mind. News articles kept coming out for 5-6 years. So she was lost, bound from Fort William for Sault Ste. Marie with a grain cargo. She struck bottom and hit like a mud bank coming out of Fort William and had to be pulled free. Eventually made it out onto the lake, and she hit a really strong localized storm after she cleared Passage Island, and it passed south of Isle Royal, and it was really violent in her area. She was last seen by the steamer Algonquin 40 miles southeast of Isle Royal. This was an intense storm with 50-mile-an-hour gusts and 15-foot waves that were hitting the Bannockburn astern. This is important because one of the things that I found that nobody had found before was an article where they interviewed the Montreal Transportation Company's blacksmith, and he said that her steering quadrant had been cracked, and he had hastily braced the steering quadrant. This is that metal bar that sits over the rudder and is used to transfer the torque to the rudder to steer. Well, if you're taking 15-foot waves on the stern of a rudder that's already weak, and it's bashing that rudder, it would easily have broken that steering quadrant. And if that happened in that kind of a sea with this vessel, she would have quickly fallen into the trough of the seas. In other words, fallen broadside to the waves, and with a grain cargo, she would have capsized. So let's talk about where she is. We know she was on this shipping lane. We know she was last seen in the early hours of Friday, 11/21/2001, right here, about 30 miles south east of Isle Royal. The steamer Huronic was bound up the lake. They claimed they saw her off of Standard Rock. I don't think they could have. It was the middle of the night, and there were other ships out that looked like her. Her sister ship, the Rosemount, looked just like her. All they saw was a lighting configuration. I don't think she ever made it this far. Here's why. The wind direction of this storm was fairly consistent out of the northwest. Here's the last known sighting. On 11/28, 7 days later, a big debris field was found right down here off Keweenaw Point, just northeast of Standard Rock. If you draw a line from the last debris with the wind, it meets up down here. Then on December 12th at Grand Marais, a bloody life jacket was found stenciled Bannockburn. You can line these all up with the wind direction. Boom, boom, boom. And she was on the shipping lane. And the wind wouldn't have blown her off the shipping lane. The wind was kind of right with her there in the shipping lane. So I think if you were to draw I think she went down soon after she was last sighted, because the captain, there were other boats that should have seen her. The steamer Chile was out, for example. I did a full inventory of all the ships that had transited the Sioux that day, and there were other ships out that should have seen her, and the ships that should have passed her right about here never saw her. So she's in this grid. One of the cool things about this story is I told this to Dan Fountain, or Dan watched my show, and he saw that on the magnetic anomaly data for Lake Superior, there happened to have been a target right out here in the middle of my grid. And so he and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society went out to the grid thinking they were going to find the Bannockburn. I was pretty sure they were going to find the Bannockburn. They found the Arlington. So this story spawned that, actually, that search out here to that location and to that geomagnetic target. The Bannockburn probably does not have a good geomagnetic signature, because that was the only thing that was out here in this grid that they saw. That doesn't mean it's not out here. It just means that it was turned the wrong way toward to the plane when they did the magnetic mapping. Or it's also quite small. It's not a really big ship, right? So it might also not show up well. But I believe that if you want to know more about this, watch my video on YouTube. I go to quite a bit more detail about it. So this is where I think it is. I think it's out here in this search grid. I think it will be found, but probably by somebody who's deliberately searching. All right. Last but not least, let's talk about the biggest ship still missing on Lake Superior, the DM Clemson. This is a 468-foot steel steamer, right? I mean, this ship could have lasted into the 1960s or 70s even, had she not gone down. She was built in 1903 at Superior, Wisconsin. She only lasted 5 years. Again, in the coal and iron ore trade. Couple of key points. I'm not the expert on the DM Clemson, but we know that she had struck the Ashtabula, Ohio Lighthouse Pier 4 weeks before the loss and damaged some of her hull plates. It's sort of speculated and she damaged a water tank when she struck, so it was a hard enough hit that it did some damage, right? That's the speculation about what caused it, because a lot of other ships were out, and that was a bad storm. It was a 50-mile-an-hour gale with 20-foot waves. She cleared the Sioux at 9:30 a.m. on November 30th, 1908, and was never seen again by another vessel or anybody else. Wreckage was sighted off Crisp Point on December 5th, and then debris came ashore between Grand Marais and Crisp Point. We believe this ship would have been on the shipping lane, but nobody survived, and there were no other vessels that claimed to have seen her. So this is where I think she was. Now, if you do the wind direction and you look at the shipping lane, because these ships could stay on a shipping lane, and they didn't deviate very often. Even in bad weather, they could just hold their nose on a compass course. So if you look at this shipping lane going around Keweenaw Point, you look at the wind direction, you look where the debris is, and you backtrack in the wind direction from the debris, you get a spot right here. I have no doubt that the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society has searched this grid. Absolutely no doubt. Could it be further this way? Sure. Why? Because maybe the wind isn't exactly here. Maybe it shifted. Maybe the wind was 10 degrees further out of the south, which would maybe put it up here, right? Maybe instead of down here. So you get the calculus why this is so hard and why the grids can get so big, because all the wind has to be is 10 degrees, further south, and the grid moves up here another 10 miles. So this is a difficult one. I give credit to those guys at Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society for going out here and looking for this, because it's a tough search far from shore. But I do believe they'll find it. I think that this is an imminent discovery. So those are the famous five. And I know last time I gave this talk, I mentioned that there was going to be at least two of these have been found, and the one that I can tell you I was talking about was the Western Reserve. There's another one, but it's not on Lake Superior, that is going to come out in the next year or two. So keep that one under my hat. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you all for joining me. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. And I am going to download this and I'm going to upload it to YouTube later, so feel free to check that out as well. I do have another one of these coming out on Lake Huron next, where I'm going to be doing the biggest ship still missing on Lake Huron and gridding the top six. So do keep an eye out for that. So thanks everybody for joining me. I hope you all have a nice evening, and I am going to shut down the Dog and Pony Show here now. So thanks again. Good night.